So I don't really know where this is, like, I don't have an outline of what I want to say exactly, but I do want to go over something. Um, there's a lot of this notion of like detachment and using detachment to have clarity. And it is certainly a large band-aid. It is a wonderful bandage, but it doesn't actually do the healing connection that restores the body, restores the being. And so I just want to go over the sensation, like an authentic sensation of detachment comes from a serotonergic response to within the body and to the environment. A very insincere form of detachment is, well, I wouldn't even call that then detachment, because there is nothing to detach from. But an insincere form of detachment is a dopaminergic response. And so people will tend to, they'll burn themselves out so that they effectively, they have to rely on a serotonergic response because they like fried the adrenal glands, or mucked up so many of their psychological connections to others that there is no authentic way of relating. And so then the only way to relate is through self-aggrandizement. And that self-aggrandizement will settle into the personality, will settle into the identity. But how it settles into the identity is through uh, constriction and boundaries. And effectively, people handing boundaries to others, handing division to others, handing separation to others. And that is not a united process. That is not a cooperative. Well, it's cooperative in that one can force a cooperation through, kind of tentative agreements to boundaries, but it is not the true coordination that the body and the brain is capable of. And so I just wanted to kind of capture that thought of like actual detachment is from a serotonergic response, just like, and let me describe it this way. It's really easy to get into it this way. So one one may want, desire, or need, or fear the not having of contentment. And so, like, I want contentment would be a dopaminergic state, would be a kind of uh, com- impulse or a compulsion from a dopaminergic state. As soon as one is re- increases the sensation of not wanting, or rather, decreases the sensation of wanting, it increases the uh, it decreases the dopaminergic response and increases the serotonergic response. As soon as the serotonergic response is created, that initial compulsion or impulse that kind of put the target on the board, the serotonergic response begins activating the circuits in the brain and in the body, and moving those circuits in the brain and the body in such a way as to allow that goal of contentment will naturally be fulfilled, because the serotonergic response is itself contentment. And so to want contentment is to be dopamine wanting serotonin. To reduce the amount of dopamine in the system is to increase the amount of serotonin in the system. The reason why I think that this requires some thought or some explanation is because we have so many of our thought processes, so many of our ideas or concepts are around identity and around intention and behavior. And all of these things are perfectly relevant to the discussion, but they are not themselves the serotonergic response. And so you might get to a serotonergic response, but how you get to a serotonergic response is going to greatly affect the quality of the state that you're in and how you can maintain it, or the degree to which you need to control or then have boundaries. And a lot of times people will have boundaries in order that they don't need to control. And so, yes, this will decrease the dopaminergic process and increase the serotonergic process. But what that person has set up with their boundaries is oftentimes a series of triggers, one more escalating than the previous, to the point where in the peace there is no treaty. In the peace there is no way to actually maintain it. It's you know, gosh, it's to say false would in some ways be an understatement, because there's so many, like, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of um, neuronal connections that are all holding this path in place in this type of thinking or in this way of thinking. And so to say that it's false is, it's like, it's not one way false, it's not two ways false, it's thousands and thousands of ways false. Or rather, it's thousands and thousands of ways of a pathway being utilized in effectively what is going to contradict it. One way to think about this, or one way that I'm thinking about this, and again, like, disagree with this as much as you'd like, absolutely, and I'm more than open and willing to see all sides of it, but this is coming from me having seen many sides of it. So I would, love to entreat the discussion. The one way of thinking about this would be there, and it happened recently, so it's just like, it's an availability heuristic. However, it kind of bears some mentioning. I was at a men's group, and there was a person that was like a guest leader for it, and it was like, yeah, it was, cool little round of hanging out with some dudes, and and very concise, and I guess effective. It was effective at doing what was being led. But towards the end of it, the person was describing, like, okay, so this is this men's group, and I'm I'm leading a workshop, and this is the workshop, and these are aspects of the workshop, and one of the aspects is to hold space for sacred combat, like the thing in your life that you're willing to fight for. And so it's like this notion of sacred combat. And don't get me wrong, it's like, yeah, there needs to be space held um, for aggression or for expression of what may be deemed more unsavory emotions or impulses. But what was coming through with that is, it's like, okay, sacred combat. You mean the thing that got us fucked up, and the reason why we're in a men's group trying to recover from having been vulnerable and having been, kind of fucked over for it, and that thing that hasn't ever resolved itself. Like, okay, we're gonna do sacred combat, which is good, because in some purview, it shows it can show that part of ourself to ourself. But in another purview, it's actually just doubling down on the exactly the irresolute notions that arise from dispute. And so it's like, we're going to hold space for sacred combat. And it's like, well, how about we hold all space for all things, and aggression can be part of that. And rather than putting it in another box in another area, receiving the catharsis of it, and then re-losing ourselves or trying to renegotiate relationships based on this like false catharsis, what if we actually just hold space for it, for us? That sometimes we want to fight, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we can resolve, sometimes we can't. And 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 the practice of holding space for others in, I suppose, these are somewhat sloppy terms, but in not neutral as to be neutralizing, but for the practice of holding neutral space so that when things aren't so neutral, there can be more of a register of what's going on, what's happening. And so it's just like we need to be holding space, not self aggrandizing, not making special space for this thing to happen that I'm trying to avoid, that I can't avoid, that actually shows up in all my relationships, but I can only have it show up here. So I have to have a support group because I can't just be supportive and holding proper space for everyone around me and have them be holding my space for me at the same time. It's like, for me, the math is really simple. It's a lot easier to be holding space for someone, as you know, like you could kind of step it up or step it down, but really holding space for a human, not holding space for a female, not holding space for a male, not holding space as a projection of uh, as a projection of a space, but holding space as a cognitive function that is really without quality or characteristic, except for the fact that we give space the characteristic through our projection. And so learning to not characterize space, or rather learning the non-qualitylessness or the qualitylessness of space, is a much more cognitively flexible framework than to try and control behavior, to try and negotiate all these different boundaries, to try and negotiate identities. And don't get me wrong, all of these things are still relevant and still show up. However, if they show up as a reaction to our own unresolved, undischarged polarities, then like internal polarities that are held um, within the structure of the brain, it could be a creative potential, but at some point it's actually just still tension, it's still stress. And that stress, believe it or not, it acts on the dopaminergic pathways: dopamine, serotonin, or dopamine, cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine. So fear, the avoidance of pain, pleasure, and stress. And so to reduce that stress is the actual function of the thing. It's not what we think it is. And even our thinking about what we think it is not what we think or what it truly is. And it's funny because we can actually think about it properly, but it's the neurotransmitters that we're utilizing uh, that enable us to do so. And so I just like kind of went longer than I was expecting on this. I wanted to make this into a short, but I just saw this person, their content about um, my life used to be chaos and I tried to control it. It's like, well, how about, and then I turned to self-aggrandizement and having probably an inordinate amount of boundaries in order to resolve my need for control in the chaos. And it's like, so you you move from wood to steel, but you haven't yet moved to water, and you haven't You haven't moved to the fire. You haven't actually balanced any of the elements. You've just moved from wood to steel. So you've just reinforced, um, uh, not negative thinking, but you've reinforced the dopaminergic pathway with your boundaries, and that can allow you some solace in coming into a serotonergic pathway. But it's not, I mean, it's not true peace. There can be true peace, and it can be organized and orchestrated and coordinated and brought between people. I think that it's just a lot easier than what's being taught, and there's a lot of teaching on the subject that is, I that is antisocial, and I don't even like to get into, like, I don't prefer psychological terminology. It's useful in that the terminology has become so ubiquitous to how we identify different aspects of our relationships, that it's it's now nearly unavoidable, either because we get labeled as something, or somebody calls us something, or something, just over and over again. But it's all the same cookie, and it's all the same crumbs. It's not, it's it it's convenient. It's convenient language, but it is not true language, or rather, it's not truly describing the mechanisms that are involved or underneath what is happening. So again, like, take it with a grain of salt. I'm not saying this as absolutes. I'm just saying this as, like, what we think we understand and what we're actually capable of processing is far greater, or what we can understand is far greater than what we've been taught and what's been taught to us. And then the ease of access to it is remarkable. It's remarkable. It's as though our brain and our body is naturally trying to bring us into perfection, and we continuously are tearing ourselves out of it and forcing. And we should be so lucky as to be able to create that division and be, well, I guess, somewhat unscathed. But the real trip comes when you realize that all of that division that you are placing at, that you've gotten rid of within yourself, you're actually placing into others. And so it's like your peace may actually be causing a lot of people a lot of turmoil, rather than how do we arrive at peace together. And the only way that I know to do that, I mean, there's lots of different moving parts on it, but the one of the most essential parts is properly holding space, or at least just understanding when you're space holding space and when you're not. And that when you're not, you're going to experience the notness of it, and and the people around you are going to experience it as well, and it is not going to be comfortable for them. And they may tell you about it, and you might actually have boundaries up against someone telling you about the peace that you are not bringing them. And then, in some aspect of control, try to avoid the hearing of it, and have a boundary against anyone describing the peace that you are robbing them by your not holding space for them. Or rather, and so this is where a lot of people get mixed up, and I may have mentioned it already, I should have hoped to have mentioned it already. But the difference between I'm holding your space for you, versus I'm holding you in my space. Why aren't you enacting my notions of space held? And don't get me wrong, it's great to be in that work where you can resonate with how someone is holding their space. But if you can't if you can't hit the gas and the brake, if you can't discern between the two, then significant there's going to be significant ramifications for that that are also happening on such a deep subconscious level that you might not even begin to understand how it might be, uh, depending on how strong you are and how dominant you are, how much damage you're doing to the people around you, the people who you say you most love. And this is why I can't necessarily give it all up to love, because it's like I'm I'm very certain slave owners loved their slaves. And so love is maybe not the merit that we think or seek that it is. So, giving it all up to love, like, oh, I still love this person. Well, of course you do, because they took on all your negative projection and you cut them out of your life. And so they got stuck with it. And so it's like, yeah, of course you love them, because you're not willing to look at the parts of you that you don't love for yourself, or, oh, I love myself. And it's like, yeah, because you put all the negative shit that is you onto others and wrap them up in it. And now uh, you bound them and freed yourself. So all that's, it's a big pill to swallow. But thanks for being with me this long.